Good morning. All right, so here we are. This is Tuesday, April 14th. And today we're continuing on in evolution. For anybody who's going to be watching this on YouTube, I really want to stress please stick around to the end. I want to make sure that you folks have a chance to hear what we're setting up for the flipped classroom, which is something that we're going to be trying tomorrow. So it should be pretty cool. I'm looking forward to it. But for right now, let's move on with our stuff. Now, this is all review. We talked about this yesterday about evolution and the change in organisms over time. We talked about Charles Darwin and his trip on board the HMS Beagle around, a chunk of the world, and how he saw those differences, the things that weren't quite the same, even though they were living very much the same way. And it made him question why or how these things existed in the first place. And ultimately, he came up with that theory that we now understand, whether you believe it or not, and that is the idea that everything came from this common ancestor, this number one, that had to be the starting point, and that since then, things have changed. Natural selection was his mechanism, and the mechanism is like the mechanics, like how you determine how a board game works. Those are the mechanics. The rules in a video game that determine success and failure. Those are all mechanics. This was his mechanic for how life existed. And just that understanding that natural selection is going to allow the best adapted to survive and pass on the traits that made them successful. And he based this because if he looked at populations and everybody survived, it was an exponential growth. It got really fast really quickly, but in nature that doesn't happen. And he surmised that that's probably because there aren't enough resources. There's not enough food, water, and mates. And combine that with the idea that differences are inherited, and now you have that struggle to exist where organisms can't all survive, so they've got to compete. And by terming this as fitness, high fitness or low fitness, for whether or not their inherited traits work well for their survival, was his idea. If you take a look at these birds, for example, this one way over here at the end with the yellow belly, the purple chest, there's blue, there's black, there's green, all sorts of these bright colors, might work great in a tropical setting. You move that bird to upstate New York, chances are these traits that might have been high fitness where it's from will now be very low fitness. And so from that, Darwin basically just came up with what he called, it wasn't called evolution, it was called descent with modification, with the idea that the successes will stay, the failures will be removed, and over time, this is going to constantly push and create a better and better organism for the current area that it lives in. And my example to you guys at the finale basically yesterday was about how all lions are basically the same golden brown color because that is the most successful color. If they're darker or lighter, it isn't as successful. They don't survive as well. They don't produce as much offspring, and therefore they don't pass on the traits for that lighter or darker color. And then I believe we finish with Lamarck, the earliest idea of descent with modification. And he had it wrong because he believed that just by wanting to, just by trying to, the body part would change. Kind of like the idea if you could see his idea if you only exercised one arm. If you only exercised one arm over and over and over again, that one arm would get very well developed, very muscular. But then he was wrong about this idea that you pass that on to your offspring. If some dude works out just in his right arm will be this big, beefy, crazy thing. But then if he has a kid, that kid's not going to be born with this giant, beefy arm. Lamarck thought they would. So that's where his one really started to fall apart. All right, so let's start talking about challenges. Darwin waited 23 years before he published his theory of what we now call evolution. And one of the major reasons for that is he recognized there were going to be some problems. He recognized some folk were not going to want to hear this. And so he decided that he had better follow scientific principle and get evidence. He had better get so much evidence, mountains, hillsides, gigantic hammers of evidence, so that when somebody said, no, I don't believe it, he could push all this evidence to them and say, here's what I have supporting my theory. What do you have? Now, these were the major three. Obviously, religion throughout Europe was predominantly Christianity, and especially back then, a lot of things were Bible literate, meaning that they took the Bible word for word as absolute truth. And you can't have God, Genesis, creation, and Darwin's theory of evolution, if for no other reason than because Darwin stated that life on Earth had to exist for a lot longer than the Christianity creation story allows. In the, I think it was 1600s, a member of the Catholic Church basically took the Bible and he took the lifespans of all the people involved and he paired them out, measured them out, and basically determined that according to the Bible, following the lifespans of each person. If you guys haven't read it, it is crazy. You should go read, especially the early parts of the Bible, because people lived for like 1,400 years. And, they might have 37 children in that time. It was, it was something. And anyway, this cardinal determined that Earth was somewhere in the neighborhood between 6 to 7,000 years old, and that was approved by the Pope and the Vatican, and it kind of became rule. Well, Darwin looked at the stuff and said, "No way, no way, it had to be much longer." So even if you put aside all of the actual species changing, just that alone was going to conflict very heavily. Then there was also the assertion he had that human beings are just animals and we've gone through this natural process just like everything in nature has. That's a problem to a lot of people. We really like to believe that we're something else. We like to think that we are this special, this unique, this ordained creature that has been brought on by divine right to exist, and we're not. We are incredibly successful, and we are capable of things that, to our knowledge, no other animal in Earth's history has ever been able to come close to. But we are still the product of the same mechanisms. And then finally, the one that people think or think of the least that they don't consider is science. So you got to understand, science was not new at this point, right? Ibn al-Haytham came up with a scientific method in what is modern day Iraq, way, way back in like the 1400s. All right, science had been around for a long time. A lot of the people in Europe at Darwin's age were funded by the church, just like he was. They made their living. They studied things, and and their studies corroborated those stories that people were told. So now, imagine working your whole life towards goals and you're very successful. And then somebody shows up and says, yeah, everything that you've been doing is wrong. All of your science, all of your achievements, you don't deserve them because the information that you based it on was faulty. Like, people are not going to be happy about that. But once again, remember, 23 years is a long time, and Darwin had a lot of evidence on his side. The first one, the major one, the fossil record. Man, people had been digging up dinosaur bones for a long time, and there were a ton of stories about where they came from and what they were. But once people started to really examine the fossils that were left behind, we started to find out a lot of really good information about this. So if you're not aware, fossils are distributed, they are dropped, and the further down you dig, the more ancient it is. Over here on the right hand side is millions of years. The Holocene, our current one, is only the last 10,000 years. The Pleistocene, the one right before that, starts at 1.8 million years ago. So the further down you go, you're going through huge, huge amounts of time in order to find these fossils. And this was part of Darwin's idea that Earth had to be very old, and that at the rate that soil drops, which for most places is like millimeters per year, not feet, it had to be extensive periods of time to show the changes that we see in the fossils and then to account for how thick some of these strata were. So basically, the idea is that we would find these fossils in the oldest rocks deeper down or in the newest rocks, and then we would dig in the opposite direction. If we found them at the top, we'd dig down. If we found them at the bottom, we'd dig up. And basically, you want to look for other species that share some characteristics with it. And then just those slight changes that occur. And that allows us to track a species through. This is the evolution of the whale, starting with Pakicetus, which was a land dwelling animal. The gray portions you see are the bones that we're missing, the bones that we believe exist, but we have not yet found them. And we've been able to track Pakicetus's evolution through each one of these as it started to move aquatic, as it went almost exclusively aquatic, and then fully aquatic as the modern day whales. Now, you may look at this and go, well, how do you know that Rhodocetus is related to Pakicetus? It's interesting that you mentioned that. Turns out Pakicetus had this tiny little like knob of bone on its skull, right? Well, we find that same knob of bone in every following fossil, all the way up and including all of the modern day whales and dolphins. So that little random knob of bone has stuck around because its existence didn't negatively affect them. And so we're able to say with a very high degree of certainty that these are all related to one another by that single odd shared characteristic. In the same place, in the same size, throughout all of their skulls, in every single member of that evolution, from the earliest form up through. We've been able to track the bone changes, which have been colored here. I've already gotten copies of the lab for today, so some people have also already done this. And this is the evolution of the horse from Eohippus, way far back, something like about 275 million years, all the way up to the modern day Equus. And we can take a look at the evolution of the skull, how that's changed, the foot structure, how that's changed, and the size of the body. All of these things line up, and they line up over and over again every time that we look at them. Now, fossilization, though, is not an easy thing to happen. This is kind of a pretty version of it, but basically the organism has to die. It has to be buried very quickly. It has to be buried before anything else can start eating at it. And then we've got to have mineralization. And mineralization is this time period where water kind of like moves through the area, and as it does, it's going to pull tiny little particles of the rock and the dirt around, and it's going to deposit those into the air spaces that exist inside the bones, inside whatever hard tissue is still left behind. That process will then create a bone, or not a bone, excuse me, a rock version of the bones for later exposure. If you were to walk through a field filled with dinosaur bones, likely you would not be able to tell just by looking at it. You would need something or someone to present it to you. I actually have a video that I normally show at this point, and I apologize that I haven't been able to, but I haven't been able to find the clip that I want online. And it's a professional paleontologist walking through a rock field, and as he's walking, he's pointing out dinosaur bones, and then the screen highlights them with a little bit of CG so you can see what he's talking about. But otherwise, it just looks like rocks. But he can clearly see the indicators that there are bones there. Really impressive. Now, we also had this evidence of shared species. So if we take a look at something like pangolins here, and I thought this was appropriate because we actually right now believe that the Chinese pangolin over here might have been the source of COVID-19. And you see that these pangolins are spread all over, but look at the distance between the western and the eastern pangolins. This huge area here, all the way across the entire Middle East. Not a single pangolin lives in those deserts and some of that dry area. Well, then how did they get there? How else do you explain so many species, so similar in so many different regions of the world? And that directly ties in to the idea of tectonic shift or the movement of plates. So if we have an animal, let's take a look at Synaganthus here, right? This little lizard. All right, this orange area across South America and Africa, that used to be its territory. So we find fossils of this dinosaur in this area of South America and that area of Africa. Now, you can ask yourself what's more likely, but it's pretty unlikely that you would have the exact same animal evolve in two very different regions in the same time period at all. It's far more likely that the continents moved apart sometime after that animal existed. And we actually have evidence of this. So this is Gondwana, which is one of the supercontinents, not quite Pangea, but similar. And let's imagine that we had some kind of Sarcosuchus here, or some sort of crocodilian ancestor that existed. And this yellow orange color basically is its territory, right? It lived everywhere throughout here. Well, nowadays, we find the remains of that spread all over the planet in these areas that are still colored orange because at one time they were all together. Even if evolution with animals is inaccurate, this proves that we're talking about long periods of time for the continents to drift this far apart. Technically, this picture was originally talking about a plant species and its fossils. I just used the dinosaur because it's more striking. And then we get to our real crux, one of the major modern day things that we can look at, homologous structures. And hopefully everybody watching this immediately cues in on something. Right there. Remember that prefix? We went over it in like the third day of school. We've repeated it about two or three other times, especially back in genetics, when we were talking about homozygous and heterozygous. And now it shows up again. And again, it means the exact same thing. Homo means same. So homologous structure doesn't even matter if you remember what logos and structure. Just remember, you saw homo. It means same. And when we take a look at the arms of most animals, yeah, we really see that. We see the same pattern repeated again and again and again. One bone, two bones, lots of little bones, fingers. One bone, two bones, lots of little bones, fingers. One bone, almost two bones, they've fused. Lots of little bones, finger. One bone, two bones, little bones, fingers. One bone, two bones, little bones, fingers. We just see it again and again and again and again. More evidence that we all came from the same thing. That evolution hasn't made new things, it's taken an existing thing and it's just tweaked it. It's modified it. Why do all of our cars and trucks have four wheels with a forward engine using a drive shaft that then transfers the power from the engine pistons to the wheels in order to cause rotation? It's because the first car we had did. And since then, we haven't tried to reinvent everything. We've just taken what works and we've tried to make it work better. It's the same process. Then we have analogous structures. Now, these are also evidence of evolution, but kind of in a different way. Instead of proving that things are related, we can use this to prove that things are not related, that there's someone or something else that they're closer related to. I'm going to take either of these diagrams at the beginning, whether you're talking about swimming or flight. What we have in each of these scenarios are three different structures that have the same function. They do the same thing, but structurally you can tell that they are not related to each other. The wings of a bat and the wings of a bird are not that similar to each other. We know that those two might be related, but it's not close. And similarly, the fin of a shark and the fin of a dolphin, if we look inside them, we can see that there's some relation, but not as much as other species may have. And the last one of our structures is going to be our vestigial structures. These are leftover pieces. These are things that once were used and were once important. This example comes straight out of one of the evolution worksheets I gave you, taking a look at whales and looking at that pelvis that still sits where a pelvis would along the spinal cord. But obviously, whales haven't needed that in millions upon millions of years, and so it's reduced. There's just kind of this couple chunks of bone just sitting there still. We can see it in other things. For something like a small mammal, a tailbone might be very useful. In human beings, well, let's just say we haven't had a tail for a while. We still have tail bones, but we don't have the tail. They're vestigial. Humans, in fact, are a huge sack of vestigial organs. There's all sorts of things that we have that we don't need. Your appendix, right now, we're starting to understand maybe it does have a purpose, but largely, its only possibility really is to kill you if something goes wrong. Goosebumps cause the hair on your body to stand up. Well, for a cat, that's useful, makes it look bigger. But we're the top of the food chain now. We don't need to look bigger. And we don't have enough hair to effectively do it anyway. And for many of you, something like wisdom teeth are really going to be one that you become very familiar with. Because at one point, before we had dental care, you lost teeth. And have new teeth come in around the age of 17 was really useful to us because it meant that maybe you'd get a few more years where you could chew your food before you starved to death. Nowadays, far, far less important. So these are our evidences of evolution. We have our fossil record, the shared species, and that geographic distribution of them, where they look like. We have our homologous, analogous, and vestigial structures. All of these are what Darwin brought in when he finally published his theory on evolution. And it's important to note once again that Darwin did this not because he wanted to. He published because there was a guy named Alfred Wallace. And Alfred Wallace basically was a student when Darwin was a big famous guy for having traveled the world. Darwin came back with his journals, published them as a book of exploration, and people loved it. So he was a celebrity for both decades until he actually published his real book and his real theory. But Wallace read all of his studies, heard a talk by him, and decided, that's amazing. I want to be just like this dude. So Wallace signed up on a different ship, did the role of naturalist, and through his journey, he came up with the same idea that Darwin had. And he said, oh my God, this idea, I've got to see what Darwin thinks. So he actually wrote a letter to Darwin saying, hey, I've got this idea. How crazy is this? And when Darwin read it, he was like, oh man, he's going to publish a paper on this before I publish the book I've been working on. So Darwin was kind of forced to publish it in order to be the first for the theory. Although, while this may sound like kind of a jerk move, Darwin actually contacted Wallace back and said, hey, listen, you know what? I did think of this, and I've actually been working on it for a really long time. Would you be interested in writing the preface, the introduction to the book that I'm going to publish about it? And Wallace was overjoyed. So Wallace wrote the intro to Darwin's book. So they kind of still went into it together. But otherwise, Darwin might have spent another 10 years gathering even more evidence. All right, this has been quite a while. But let me talk about what we're going to be doing tomorrow. So if you open up Schoology, right, you guys should see it looking something like this. All right, so for today, we have a pretty simple lab, evidence of evolution lab. It's very straightforward. You're just going to fill stuff out. It wants you to color the bones. Don't worry about coloring the bones. I don't want you guys to color them. The picture that I got for this, the bones are already kind of shaded to denote which ones are the same and which ones are different. So don't worry about coloring them. That's fine. For this one, please. Oh, I've had people write out these paragraphs already about what's different about the different arms. No, no, no. Function. What's their job? Whales use their arm to do what? Cats use their arm to do what? That's it. Then you're going to go down here to our analogous structures. What that means. Our vestigial structures, right here between the cave fish and the minnow. And then vestigial structures in people. What did they probably do in this column? And then why are they vestigial now? Why are they no longer needed? Some of these I've already talked about. And then you just have three little questions. So the lab should be very easy, I hope. Oh, what I want to talk about is this folder, flipped material for Wednesday. If you take a look in here, you will find 5 links to PBS Eons, which is an amazing, amazing series of videos. They have hundreds of videos now, all about evolution. Every single one of them is about the fossil record and evolution and how we understand it and what those ancient ages mean and how old Earth is and stuff like that. Here are 5 of them. I want you to watch one. Any one of these. If you want to do more, by all means, please do more. But you only need to view one. I want you guys to watch one of them. Tomorrow, we're going to start a discussion. I'm going to give you the rules for it tomorrow, but it's going to be based some on watching these videos, and they talk about how the organisms changed over time, what in their environment changed that caused them to evolve. First one's on whales, second one horses, third one penguins, the fourth one is on pterosaurs, flying dinosaurs, and last one's on turtles. So I think that these are really interesting. They're incredibly well done, and just watch one of them for me before we get together tomorrow. So with that, you guys have your plans. I will warn you, tomorrow is just going to be this discussion type of project thing. That's it. I'm going to come on. I will probably do a video for it, but it's probably going to be about 4 minutes long because it's just going to be what the goal is, and then I'm just going to let you guys have time. Thursday, we're going to come back. We'll have a little bit more in the way of notes. Not a lot, little bit. And then I'm going to have one more, not quite a lab in this case, more of an activity for you guys to do. And then on Friday, I'm going to be here for questions regarding the marking period, work, stuff like that. But I am not going to be presenting new material on Friday. Starting next week, we'll continue on with evolution. We'll probably be looking at our test for evolution just before the end of this month. We're scheduled to return on the 30th. We will probably be looking at the test on something like Tuesday, the 28th. So, if you have any questions, please contact me. Let me know either through Schoology on email. You guys know the drill. Take care.